A bride in white waited at the station for 3 hours. No groom, no apology, just a stranger who said, "Get in." Nobody wants to see a person left behind, especially not in a wedding dress. But at Frontier Bluff Station, autumn of 1888, the whole town turned its face the other way. Clara stood there, hand still clenched around the handle of her valise, a lace glove torn at the forefinger, as if letting go would send everything left inside her shattering to the ground. The groom never showed. The letter proposing marriage vanished with the last train, and just as she turned to leave, a stranger, no smile, no soft words, pulled up his wagon and said 3 quiet ones. "You got anywhere to go?" There was no ring, no flowers, but somewhere between the red dust and a gaze that didn't flinch, a new life began. Not from a vow, but from a nod. And so one of the most soul-stirring Wild West love stories began. Not because of love, but because someone chose to stop and see her. Frontier Bluffs Station, early autumn, 1888. The sun had passed its peak, yet it still hadn't dried the lingering damp along the eaves of the Frontier Bluffs depot. Morning mist clung like a forgotten thought to the scratched window panes of the dispatch room. A faint wind curled through the platform, carrying the scent of rusted iron and the dust kicked up by the last train. And in that air, thick with everything unspoken, Clara stood, her ivory wedding dress snug against a frame weary from the ride, its hem now dust-stained and creased in the way only hours on a train without a destination can leave a woman marked. A lone crow landed on the roof's edge, claws tapping against old timber, letting out a clipped caw, sharp, resigned, like a verdict. Clara didn't look up. She'd heard enough whistles of departing engines, seen enough people pass with eyes that refused to settle on her. The veil had been removed, folded neatly beside her worn leather valise. Her white lace gloves, chosen with care once for this very day, were now smudged brown at the seams, a tear creeping up the forefinger of the right hand. The station mistress approached, torn between duty and discomfort. Her voice, barely above a whisper, seemed afraid to stir what had already died behind Clara's eyes. "There's no one here for you." And with that, she fell silent, as if the words themselves had drawn blood she wasn't proud to shed. Clara gave the smallest nod. No question, no protest. She had known, really. Knew it when the 30-minute mark passed, then 45, then an hour, when the groom hadn't shown, and the house where the wedding was meant to be remained silent as the grave. No hoofbeats, no wagon wheels, no bashful man holding wildflowers from the western trails. Just her, and the gray wind catching in the layers of lace that once meant something. She didn't cry, didn't clutch at strangers, begging for reasons, but her fingers gripped the handle of her valise, the way a woman does when she knows she'll have to carry her bruises forward, whether or not the road ahead is known. At the far edge of the red dirt road slicing through town, a wagon came to a stop. No whinny, no call. Just a tall man in a long black coat, crouched by the reins, adjusting the tack. His hands moved steady, not rushed, but with purpose. When he rose, he dusted his palms against sun-bleached trousers, then glanced toward the platform. It wasn't a look you give a stranger. It was the kind of glance a man gives something out of place, like seeing a bloom whole and upright in a patch of mud. Clara met his gaze, not because he stared, but because he didn't look away. Of all who passed her that day, he was the only one who let his eyes rest on her without shame or pity. Perhaps that meant nothing. But in a day that stripped her of everything, a gaze that didn't flinch was something she'd remember. She didn't go to him. Instead, she sat on the warped bench beneath the depot awning, the kind of bench that creaked under time. Her hands smoothed the folds of her dress, over and over, as if reclaiming a small dignity from the wreckage of plans that no longer mattered. Evening crept in, uncertain if it wanted to settle or stretch further. No trains came. The station mistress had retreated indoors, leaving only the silence to keep company. Clara remained, still as stone, carved of flesh, unmoving, yet undeniably alive. A breeze picked up again, rougher this time, carrying dry leaves from the cemetery beyond town. One struck her hat, resting atop the valise, then fluttered to the ground. She bent down, picked it up, studied it, then slid it into the pocket of her coat, as if to mark the day she was left behind with something that touched her before it disappeared. When she rose again, her hand trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of having to choose a direction. Her eyes scanned the road, but all paths were cloaked in the same old dust. Then came the sound, hooves on packed earth, steady, slow. The same wagon, not too near, not too far. The same man, unreadable face, pulled up in front of the station, said nothing. He climbed down, crossed the road into the telegraph office. Clara stood where she had all along. She could have asked for a ride, but pride, the last piece left unbroken after this day, held her in place. She didn't move, just stood. The man emerged, still unhurried. As he passed her, he paused longer this time, eyes resting on hers. His voice, rough like tobacco paper rubbed thin over time, asked simply, "You got anywhere to go?" She shook her head. Her throat, dry from silence, wouldn't let words out. He gave a quiet nod, then motioned to the back of his wagon. "Get in." No promise. No future painted in sweet colors. Just an offer, between two people with no reason to trust, except the kind of kindness that doesn't ask for explanations. Clara looked at him, then back at the home platform that was supposed to be the start of a life, a different life, with a man who promised flowers and a suit coat. She lifted her skirt, hoisted the valise, and climbed into the wagon bed. The wind caught her dress, trailing a faded white line through the falling dusk. No one in town looked up, and the wagon rolled on. Wooden wheels groaned, bearing away a woman no longer waiting to be claimed. Julian McCrae wasn't the sort of man easily moved. After 47 years spent among ruin and revival, he'd learned not to turn back when someone fell. Not because he lacked heart, but because too many times, when he'd reached down, he was the one dragged under. Once he'd been a respected businessman in Boston, owned a printing house with 48 workers, 3 warehouse rows, and an office with glass imported from Germany. But in the spring of 1885, when fire rose from the southern wing, no one got word to him fast enough. 2 hours later, it was all ash. Within 3 months, he lost everything: home, business, reputation, and a wife who decided his hands no longer held a future worth staying for. Since then, he never lingered. Every town was a stopover. Every wagon ride, a reason to leave. Every person he met was just someone passing through. But that afternoon, while signing a wire to Wyoming to place a deposit on a shipment of genuine leather saddles, he turned and saw her. Not saw in the way one sees with eyes, but felt, like the air rearranging itself around someone others had failed to notice. She stood on the platform, Wedding dress creased, hem caked with dirt, hair falling halfway loose, as if she'd taken off a bonnet without knowing whether to ever put it back on. But that wasn't what made him pause. She wasn't beautiful, not in the way that stops men mid-step. It was the way she sat on that warped bench, smoothing the folds of her dress like she was tending the last shreds of her dignity, even as the world had just refused her. And then she stood. He saw it. That moment. Small, but clearer than anything else all day. When Clara hoisted the valise and straightened her spine as if standing upright was all that kept her from shattering. Maybe the wind bit at her. Maybe she was cold. But she didn't draw her shawl tighter. She stood like a question no one dared to answer. Julian didn't decide to approach her. His feet had already stepped off the sidewalk before the thought fully formed. His wagon still waited at the curb, wheels coated in dust, his black stallion, Harlow, chewing hay from a roadside bin. He didn't have to stop, but for the first time in years, his heart wouldn't let him go on. He stopped 3 paces from her. She didn't look up right away, but when she did, her eyes weren't broken. They were bright, not shining like tears, but bright like a mirror held up to a stranger. If you mean to help, be sure of it. If not, don't mistake me for someone needing pity. He asked her, without softening his voice, "You got anywhere to go?" She shook her head. The motion was barely there, slow, as if even she wasn't sure anymore if that was the truth. Julian gave a single nod, said nothing more, just stepped back, turned toward the wagon, and said low enough for her to follow if she chose, "Get in." And he climbed up first. No glance back, no rush, no hand offered. Because the unforgettable, kindest thing he could do for a woman the town had already cast aside was not make her feel like she had to be rescued. Harlow pulled them down the main road. A few children playing in the dirt looked up, then returned to their games. An old woman on a porch, hanging tobacco leaves to dry, didn't even pause her hands. Clara sat in the back, fingers curled lightly around the wagon rail, her veil rolled and resting on her lap. She didn't know where she was going. Julian hadn't told her. They said nothing. But the quiet wasn't tense. It was the kind of silence 2 strangers share beneath a lean-to in a sudden storm. No need for names, no need for stories. Just the knowing that, for now, the other hadn't done them harm. The McCrae Ranch wasn't the kind of place anyone dreamed of living. It was a patch of cracked land, stretched wide across sun-dried red dirt, like the peeling hide of some old beast left too long in the sun. The house, a lopsided wooden frame with a roof patched from leftover tiles, stood bare against the fields, not built out of hope, but out of refusal. A refusal to yield to what couldn't be outrun. Clara stepped down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the ride. Before her stood a porch slanting ever so slightly to the east, pine steps worn smooth in the center from years of passing boots. A rosemary bush leaned crooked beneath the window, its scent catching in the wind like an old man sighing. Nothing was pretty, but nothing lied. Julian pointed toward the room off the kitchen. A narrow space with a single bed, wool blankets folded sharp, a square window, and a wooden table scorched black in one corner. He said more to himself than to her, "Stay here until you know where you're headed." No questions, no conditions. In that silence there was something curiously whole, like 2 storm survivors who'd found shelter beneath the same unbroken beam and silently agreed not to ask where the other had come from. In those early days, they didn't cross paths much. Julian left for the fields at dawn, a hunk of dry bread and tin of cold coffee in hand. Clara rose later, not out of idleness, but because the first night in that room, a space that wasn't home but no longer felt strange, had left her sleepless. Every sound rang too clear: the tap of branches on the window, the wind threading through roof slats, Julian's steps as he passed the hallway just before first light. She didn't ask where he went. He didn't tell her. But by the third day, the silence between them started to shift. When Julian returned from the fields, next to his usual coffee mug was something new: a piece of cornbread, dry, crisp, baked from the last of the cornmeal Clara had found in the back cupboard. No note, no explanation. Just one corner tilted slightly, like a quiet nod from across the room. He didn't touch it that evening. But the next day, he came home earlier. And that night, he brought back a sack of rice, set it down beside the stove, said nothing. Clara saw it, gave a small nod, asked nothing. The morning after, he noticed a rough burlap cloth laid across the kitchen table. She must have found it in one of the trunks, or maybe she'd stitched it herself. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. They spoke to each other in small offerings. A chair nudged closer to the hearth on a cold night. Julian fixing the coat hook near the door. Clara folding a handkerchief and hanging it there. No compliments, no gratitude, but neither one let those things go unnoticed. On the seventh evening, Julian set the table for two. He didn't call her, didn't gesture, but as Clara passed by, she paused, not from hunger, but from something in that quiet gesture that asked nothing of her, yet felt like a door left unlatched on purpose. They ate together. No words. The clink of spoon on plate beat out a slow rhythm, like a clock trying to remember time. Clara ate with care, sitting upright, resting her hands in her lap between bites. Julian looked toward the steady burn in the hearth, as though waiting for the fire to say something he himself couldn't name. Afterward, Clara washed the dishes. No one asked her to. No one expected it. Julian swept the ashes and stacked new wood. No one said thank you. No one said make yourself at home. But from that night on, a second chair remained at the table, and an extra plate waited beside it. One morning, before the sky had fully shaken off the dark, Clara stood at the front door, a mug of hot water warming her hands. She watched Julian return from the stables, coat dusted with frost. He walked slow, like a man who'd carried too many winters in his bones. As he neared, she shifted slightly, held out the cup. He didn't speak, didn't reach for it. Just touched her hand, held the cup a moment, then walked past her into the house. That morning, Clara caught sight of herself in the fogged mirror at the hallway's end. Nothing had changed. Her hair still tied neat, shadows still beneath her eyes. But she lingered longer than usual, perhaps because for the first time the reflection didn't look like a woman left behind, but like someone paused at the threshold of something unnamed, yet quietly beginning. The ranch, that crooked house, wasn't a place anyone longed for. But in the stillness of those days, it became something else. A resting place for two souls no longer chosen by the world, yet not quite ready to leave it behind. It didn't matter how long it lasted. Only, however now, it was quiet enough for neither to be on guard, and still enough for kindness to fall, slow and unnoticed, like water soaking into long-starved earth. Mornings at the McCrae Ranch didn't begin with a bell or a call. They started with the sky, easing from slate blue to silver, as if the world itself was trying not to startle. A thin layer of frost settled across the fence rails and bare branches, muffling the land like someone laying a soft sheet over old bones. No one called out to wake the other. No one brewed coffee for two. Yet somehow, they breathed to the same rhythm. Clara rose early. She washed clothes down by the shallow creek, about 30 paces from the house, a stream just clean enough to hold the reflection of morning. Shirts, rough trousers, dish rags, even the worn cloth lining the chicken coop, each was washed in a quiet order. Lights before darks, kitchen rags before garments. No one had taught her this. She never said why. But after each shirt was wrung out, she looked skyward, as if waiting for someone to nod before she continued. Julian spent most afternoons at the forge, tending to horseshoes. He never worked past sundown. Maybe because evening light cast shadows longer than they truly were. And a man who'd seen things crumble didn't like the look of himself stretched across a dying field. His hands bore oil stains, his fingernails rimmed with dirt, and the back of his shirt was always damp with sweat. Clara would leave a damp rag on the railing near the hitching post. Never announced, never explained. Just there. The way steady things ought to be. Between them, there was silence, but not the hollow kind. It was like a mossy path through old woods. Quiet, yes, but alive. Only those who moved slowly and stepped with care could walk it without disturbing the ground beneath. Evenings were lit by a soft oil lamp that cast golden puddles on the main room's walls. Julian read old books, not to remember, but because books were the only things that didn't ask to be answered. Clara sat by the doorway, mending torn seams, not out of thrift, but because fixing was easier than throwing away. On the 14th night since Clara arrived, the wind changed. It blew hard down from the mountains, hissing through the tin roof of the kitchen like brittle old bones cracking in the dark. Julian rose from his chair, closed his book, slipped into his coat, and stepped outside. He expected nothing, just wanted to see what hadn't yet fallen apart. But when he pushed open the back door, the wind caught the flap of his coat and snapped it skyward. In the haze of shifting lantern light, he saw Clara on the ladder, hands clutching the tin sheeting that had started to lift. Her dress was pulled out of place, the braid in her hair half undone, and her fingers were white-knuckled around the edge of the roof, as though she alone could hold the kitchen from being swept away. Julian stepped forward fast, his voice low but urgent. "You don't have to do that." She didn't look down, only answered through the wind, her breath catching cold against her cheek. "If I don't, the sequel, wind'll take the whole kitchen." He said nothing more, just held the ladder still for her descent. When her feet touched the ground, he didn't touch her shoulder, didn't ask if she was hurt. But there, under the flicker of weak lantern light, with dust on her cheeks and sweat clinging to her brow, Clara stood without a word. Julian turned, walked inside and returned with his coat, draped it over her shoulders, said nothing. That night, they didn't eat supper. Not out of anger, but because some nights, just keeping the roof in place was all the strength they had. Later, as Julian lit the fire back to life, he found the cast iron pot still warm, its lid snug, steam barely escaping. She had saved him a portion. And the next morning, when he went to fetch water from the creek, he saw the old clothesline had been replaced with new cord. No one had seen it done. No one asked. But he stood there a moment, watching shirts dance in the morning breeze, like something had been held in place, if only by the hands of someone with nothing left to hold on to, but still willing to try. Evenings at the McCrae Ranch didn't sound like they did in other places. No singing after supper, no melodies drifting from the parlor, just the clink of a glass against a basin, the soft rush of dishwater, the hush of wind brushing against coarse linen curtains. And then, as the fire burned low in the stove, Clara would rise, offer Julian a silent nod, and slip away to the room just off the kitchen. She always closed the door quietly, as if afraid the noise might disturb something she hadn't named yet, something held lightly, like a breath. Inside, the oil lamp was always turned down low, just bright enough to cast a halo over a small wooden table, where a chipped fountain pen lay beside a stack of yellowed paper. Clara wrote every night. Not much, not fast, and never with the intent of mailing anything. She didn't call it a journal. No one who'd lived in the past wished to relive it line by line. But for Clara, writing was the only way to keep the unsaid from screaming its way out. She didn't know if anyone would ever read such pages, but she knew this. If left inside too long, pain will find its own exit, and it won't be gentle. So she wrote. Wrote of her father, lost to a foolish wager that cost more than coin. Wrote of a sister who stayed silent when one word might have changed everything. Wrote of a love never named, reduced to a bartered promise and a wedding dress never worn. But mostly, she wrote to herself, as if each letter was for a friend she'd never meet in this life. And each morning, before the light broke gold, Clara would step outside. No basket, no shawl, just her hands cupping the folded pages. She walked to the lone dead pine behind the stables. There she burned the letters, slow, gentle, letting the paper curl and blacken, the words rise and dissolve into smoke. When nothing remained, she'd use her heel to dig a shallow hollow, burying the ashes where no one would find them. No one ever saw. No one was meant to. Julian McCrae had his own silence. At the far end of the house, left of the stairwell, was a room that stayed closed. The door was never locked, but no one opened it. Not when he fixed the floorboards, not when guests wandered too close, not even during the spring when the roof leaked and the paint peeled. His answer was always the same, a shake of the head, followed by a change of subject. No one entered, and somehow the house respected it. The floor before the door stayed swept. No boots ever rested against the wall. Nothing leaned on the frame, as if the room were a limb still living, just not to be touched. One evening, Clara climbed to the attic to fetch an old blanket. She hadn't decided what she'd do with it, only that it smelled of mildew and ought to be washed. As she walked the hallway, her hand brushed against the cold brass of that doorknob. A chill ran up her fingers like static. She paused, didn't turn it, didn't step closer. But in that pause, Julian saw her. He stood at the other end of the hall, a steaming mug of tea in hand, the lamplight behind him stretching his shadow long across the boards. He said nothing. She didn't explain, only lowered her head, hugged the blanket close and turned away. They never spoke of it. But the next morning, outside her door, Clara found a book, old leather cover, frayed spine. The title still legible, We Don't Always Start Over from the Beginning. No name, no note. She picked it up, ran her fingers over the worn edges like tracing the skin of something ancient and still alive, something waiting. She didn't open it right away. She placed it gently beside the ink bottle and stack of blank paper. That night, she didn't burn any letters. She didn't write. She didn't sigh. She just sat. The lamp burned low. Her shadow wavered on the wall, trembling slightly with the draft. Elsewhere in the house, Julian sat in his armchair, not reading the paper, as he usually did, just staring at the fireplace, now cold. His fingers drifted across the worn armrest, brushing over a small crescent gouge in the wood. It was the first mark his boy had left, scratched with baby nails during his early days of crawling, long before words. That room at the end of the hall had once been his, and since the day his wife left, it had remained untouched. No one had entered, not from anger, but because Julian feared what still lived in there, untouched, unsaid. But that night, he knew. Some things, even when they don't heal, shouldn't be locked away forever. He stood, stepped outside. The air was sharp, but beside the dead pine, the ash pile was still warm. The morning began, as most did at the McCrae Ranch, with familiar sounds that barely spoke, but always said enough. The soft sputter of the wood stove waking to life, the drifting scent of weak coffee crossing the threshold, and the thin gold of sun slicing through the earth-toned curtain Clara washed every week, without fail. Julian McCrae took his seat at the table the way he always had. Same old wool sweater, occasionally tugging the sleeves down, only to push them up again. Clara stood at the basin, hands lost in warm, soapy water. Nothing unusual, until the sound. A break, not of a dropped cup, but of something deeper, sharper, the kind of shatter a house doesn't forget. Clara stopped mid-motion. She turned. He was still standing. Still. Right hand clenched mid-air, blood welling between his fingers. A broken mug lay at his feet, dark coffee spreading out across the wood floor, mingling with thick drops of red. No one cried out. No rush. Just Clara stepping forward, calm and steady, like she'd done it 100 times before. She didn't speak, didn't gasp, only took his hand, turned it gently in hers, and studied the wound. Blood soaked into the fabric of her sleeve, but she didn't seem to notice. Julian didn't pull away. The kitchen light had dropped low through the window, casting silver into the streaks at his temple. Clara rinsed the cut, wrapped it in clean cloth, tied it neatly. Not once did she look up. Only at his hand, open now on the table, fingers resting uncertain, like they hadn't yet decided whether to reach or remain. Julian murmured something. Thank you, maybe. So quiet she wasn't sure she heard it at all. The next morning, he didn't come down for breakfast. That was unlike him. Clara set the table anyway, then placed a plate of eggs, a slice of bread, and a cup of milk on a tray. She climbed the stairs. His room was empty, but when she returned to the kitchen, she found a folded piece of paper resting beside a fresh mug. The handwriting was strong, leaning slightly right. If you need anything, just say. I don't ask easily, but I know how to see. She stood a long time with that note in hand. Not from shock, but because she didn't know how to thank someone except with silence. That afternoon, the sun turned sharp. Its light cut through cobwebs strung tight along the porch beams. Julian was out near the barn, bent over a horse's hoof, back straining with each hammer blow. The sound echoed off the ridge, and drifted off like a slow heartbeat into the dry wind. He didn't see her step into the old supply shed, didn't ask why she went, didn't watch where she walked. But that night, when he returned to the kitchen to fetch a warm cloth for his bandaged hand, his eyes caught on something new. A shirt, hung neatly on the peg across from the table. Clean, pressed, the collar stitched in a straight, tight line. One he had thought no one noticed. It was the same shirt he'd tossed into the shed last winter. Forgotten, never meant to be worn again. But there it was, hung up without asking, without words, like a whisper. I noticed. Clara didn't eat supper with him that night. She said she was full. Still, he poured a second cup of tea and set it gently near her empty chair. He ate in silence. Afterward, she washed the dishes. The water ran softly, as though the house itself had learned how to breathe slower. That night, neither of them wrote. Neither burned paper. Neither touched the door at the end of the hall. But something had shifted. No longer just gratitude. No longer a rescuer and the rescued. But quiet movements growing into rhythm, like the way he left her a note, the way she hung his shirt, the way they passed each other in the kitchen, never touching, but no longer apart. Julian sat on the porch steps, wrapped in the very shirt Clara had mended. His hand throbbed faintly beneath the bandage, but he didn't mind. In his other hand, a new mug. Heavier. Firmer. And this time, it held. Evening wind slipped across the red-dusted fields. Far off, the old mule brayed, sounding almost like laughter, or maybe just a tired reminder that life moved on, even if slow and strange. Julian looked back at the kitchen window, where one soft light still burned. Faint, but steady. No one called it love. But clearly, something had begun to take the place of loneliness. Evening settled over the land like it had for years, gently, habitually, as if silence itself were part of the soil. The sunlight didn't glare, didn't glow, but sifted through the curtains like a memory never named, falling across the kitchen's uneven floor in soft, mottled patches. Everything in the stone house looked unchanged. No smoke, no voices. But Julian McCrae sensed something had shifted, not in the air, in the stillness that filled it. He'd just returned from the henhouse, where he'd mended a hinge on the back gate. Straw clung to his boots, a streak of white paste stained his shirt sleeve. But he didn't call out as he passed the porch. Not because he was tired, but because he'd caught something peculiar. Clara's silhouette slipping through the kitchen, quiet and quick, like someone caught between hiding and habit. Julian paused at the threshold, boots unshuffled. He leaned toward the frame, eyes following the angle of late light slanting low. There she was, kneeling, folded small into herself. One hand reached beneath the dining table, sliding the edge of a floorboard loose. Quickly, efficiently, like someone who'd done it many times before. A faint click followed as a small wooden box disappeared into the gap beneath. She fitted the board back with care, then tested its corners with her fingertips, like a carpenter checking her own work. Julian stepped back before his shadow could spill across the floor. He walked around the house, opened the front door, slow and deliberate. When Clara re-entered with a basket of root vegetables, all she saw was Julian tapping dust from his boots on the front step. His face unreadable, movements simple. But that evening, when she went to return the broom to its place, she found it already there, tucked exactly where she always left it behind the shed. A message. I saw, but I won't break it. The moon that night was no more than a sliver of silver thread. No wind, but cold enough that even the leaves seemed to tighten against unspoken things. Julian waited until her lamp dimmed behind the door. Barefoot, no lantern. He moved through the hallway by memory. In the kitchen, he knelt beside the third tile from the table's edge. With his fingernail, he teased the board loose. The box lay beneath, small, unlocked. The corner marked with a carved daisy, a design he recognized from a craftsman in Arkansas. The kind who didn't make boxes for coin, but to hold something that shouldn't be forgotten. He opened it. Inside, the papers were old, yellowed, but meticulously kept. Some were letters. Most were notes, names, dates, bank transfers, code numbers, recipient markings. Some in unknown hands, many in Clara's. Quick, short, precise. Not love letters, not a will. They were records, evidence, the traces of a transaction, a betrayal, or a life once watched closely. Perhaps all three. Julian didn't feel anger, didn't feel surprise. Everyone he knew carried a box like this. The only difference was how well they'd hidden it, and whether someone would choose not to ask when they finally stumbled across it. He returned every page to its place, in order. Set the board back without a sound. The next morning dawned softer. Clouds hung low like melted wax. Sunlight held behind the ridgeline. The southern breeze brought with it a trace of hay and the last pollen of the season. Julian sat on the porch in his usual chair. In his hand, one letter, carefully unfolded. Not his. One from the box. He hadn't stolen it, only borrowed it for a second look. Not to decipher, but to understand. Clara stepped outside, a pot of tea balanced in her hands. She didn't glance at the paper, didn't ask. She placed his cup beside him, not close, not far, then turned back. Julian watched her from under the brim of his hat. Didn't call out, but just before she reached the door, he spoke, softly. "Nellie's dropping by this week," he said. "She needs help sorting the old medicine cupboard." Clara paused, hand resting on the doorframe. Julian's voice lowered. "If you can, maybe don't head into town for a few days. There's a chance someone still remembers your face." A pause. No reply. Then Clara turned the knob, quietly. But he saw her fingers linger on the wood. A silent thank you offered without needing to say so. That afternoon, Clara watered the new onion patch behind the house. The sound of the water slapping soil kept time with Julian's hammer at the goat shed. Their rhythms tangled gently, a music made of labor and distance and something not yet said. They didn't speak of the box, didn't speak of the names, or the reason for the secrecy. But something had been seen, and a protection had been offered. Not out of duty, not out of affection, but simply because someone no longer needed to hide. That night, Clara stood in the kitchen under the flicker of the oil lamp. She placed a hand on the same old board. Didn't lift it. Didn't check. She just let her palm rest there, like a breath held longer than usual, as if to tell whatever lived inside her, whatever had stayed quiet too long. "I know you know, and we won't harm this again." She turned, extinguished the lamp, and the kitchen, like everything else, returned to its usual hush. Soft, measured, warm enough for a small secret to sleep beneath the floorboards, without fear of being unearthed. Not everyone who finds your secret wants to break it open. Some just want to let it stay where it is, the way they, too, once hoped someone would let them remain untouched. That morning, the first sunlight touched the old wooden steps just long enough for Clara to see it. The new lock affixed to the back door, shining like a lone coin wedged in a crack of time. That door had always been held shut by a warped wooden bar, long since twisted out of its frame. It never truly kept anyone out, nor stopped anyone from leaving. It was just a habit, a gesture left behind by a hand that once knew how to hold on, but never dared to cling. Clara stood in the kitchen, apron still dusted with the scent of bread, quietly watching the dull brass gleam against the sun-bleached doorframe. No one had said anything about the lock. No receipt left on the dining table, the place where Julian always laid out the house's expenses, down to wire and nails. But she knew in this house nothing was ever done by accident, just like the old saddle blanket she used when riding down to the creek. The leather, once cracked, was now lined with thick canvas, hand-stitched, firm, deliberate. No note left, but each seam felt like a word unsaid. I know, and I am not afraid of it. And that alone was enough. Enough for Clara to know that Julian had read something. Maybe the pages she hid in the drawer of the old writing desk. Maybe the telegram copy from Chicago. Maybe the half-written affidavit she'd once meant to burn, then buried beneath a sack of flour instead. She didn't ask when he might have read it. Could have been one early morning while she slept. Could have been while she was in the woods picking berries. The house left still as if no soul had ever passed through it. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was this. He didn't say a word, didn't press, didn't slam a door the way others had. He simply left a new lock, a mended saddle blanket, and at every meal there were still 2 sets of silverware, never missing. That afternoon, Clara walked to the end of the hall. That room had stayed closed for as long as she'd been there. No one had forbidden her to enter, but neither had anyone invited her in. Today, the door was slightly ajar. Not locked. Left just so. Like someone had done it on purpose, for whoever had the courage to cross that threshold. But she didn't reach for the handle. Not out of fear, but because some rooms aren't meant to be opened. Not because someone inside doesn't want you there, but because some losses shouldn't be touched unless you've known what it means to carry one of your own. Through the narrow gap, the afternoon light spilled across a tilted photograph on the wall. A woman in a white dress, one hand holding a book, her body leaning slightly into the light, as if waiting for someone who had just stepped out of frame. The face was blurred, but Clara knew that woman had once belonged in this house. And now, Clara had to ask herself, did she want a place like that too? She didn't leave a question behind. No suitcase packed, no signs of departure. Only a small piece of paper folded in half, laid on the dining table, the place where they'd sat each morning, sharing silence like ritual. Where each night, dinner passed between them with no praise, but no plate ever left untouched. The handwriting was uneven, unpolished, but clear enough to be heard. I used to wish someone would believe me, before they asked why I'd stayed silent so long. The next morning, Julian found the note while making coffee. He didn't read it aloud, didn't sit. He just held it, unfolded the edge, and gently traced the worn crease with his fingertip. A mark softened by time, by being gripped too tightly, too long. before someone finally found the courage to lay it down. He didn't call her name, didn't go searching. He simply stood still for a long while in the soft-lit kitchen. Outside, spring wind slipped through the back door, the door now fitted with a new lock, carrying the scent of young mint from the garden. And in that quiet breeze, Julian thought, not everything in life is meant to be kept, but some things, just not being thrown away, is already enough. When Clara returned just before midday, hands full of lemon balm gathered along the creek, she saw the napkin folded neatly at her usual seat. No words were exchanged, only the sound of a knife slicing into crust, only the clink of a spoon stirring tea. But the two of them, two backs turned to the world, had begun to understand one another not through questions, but through silences no longer filled with strain. A lock wasn't put there to keep her in. A door left ajar didn't demand to be opened. And a small note, no longer a defense but an offering of trust laid down, not to be forgiven, but because at last there was nothing left that had to be hidden. That afternoon, Dust Hollow didn't rest the way it usually did. The wind shifted in from the southern plains, carrying with it the scent of freshly turned earth and the disjointed cries of crows beating northward. The horses grew restless in the corral, hooves stamping, nostrils flaring, as if they too sensed something off in the air. Clara was rinsing greens under the outdoor pump when she saw Nellie, widow of the red brick homestead across the ridge, push open the kitchen door without removing her hat. Her eyes were heavy, as though they'd just borne witness to something that should have remained unseen. "3 men," Nellie said, voice low but certain. "One of them wears a bounty badge. They're asking questions outstone by the lower fence." Clara froze, her hands still submerged in the cold basin. Julian didn't look at her. He set the cup he was washing down, dried his hands on the edge of his apron, and walked out the back door. No questions, no glances. At the rain barrel, he splashed water over his face, then stepped inside, changed into an old coat, faded, the right sleeve still marked with a faint singe. Not the kind of coat one wore to impress, the kind kept only when it had once helped you survive something no one else could. Clara stood in the doorway, hands still damp. She didn't speak. She just watched him move. Part of the house now, weathered, worn, but unshakable. The men came to the edge of the old fence, didn't tie off their horses, didn't dismount, close enough to loom, far enough to retreat. The lead wore a black tie and a polished badge hooked at his belt, not the kind handed out by law, but the kind that fed on its blind spots. His voice had that nasal drawl from the east. "We're looking for Clara Harper, related to a civil banking inquiry in Illinois. There's an unsettled transfer, and she's been summoned." Julian wasn't armed, didn't stand on the porch, didn't raise his voice like some puffed-up man drawing a line in the dust. He walked into the yard, where his shadow fell across the dirt, and the wind couldn't drown a word. "She lives here," Julian said, his voice low, flat, honest, as if naming the weather. A silence followed. Then, "She's my wife." The man blinked. A flicker passed through his expression. Not fear, just a plan unsettled. The second man tugged his reins tighter. The third, a wiry figure with October-gray eyes, pulled a cigarette from his coat but never lit it. Julian stood, shadow long behind him, shoulders steady as pine timber that refused to bend to years. "If you've got papers, I'll read them," If not, he said, then let's be clear. The woman you're looking for is my wife. She lives under this roof. And if you mean to take her without the law, you'll have to walk over my body first. It wasn't a threat. It carried no heat. It smelled of old wood, dry grass, and memories that had survived being burned, of someone who had once stood alone between life and death and didn't flinch. No one drew. No horses screamed. No dust rose in protest. Just three men who turned their mounts in silence, because they had seen what even the law sometimes can't take. A man willing to lose everything for what he's chosen to protect. That night, Clara poured tea as always, but for the first time she didn't set Julian's cup across from hers. She slid it just a little closer. A quiet shift. Enough for anyone watching to know. Two places at the table had become one. Julian said nothing, didn't recount the conversation, didn't ask if she'd heard. He knew. In this house with the cracked wall on the west side, everything was heard, even if not spoken aloud. Clara washed her hands, then stepped beside him. No embrace, no name spoken, only a single touch. Her fingertips resting for a moment on the singed patch of his sleeve, then pulling away. Just that. But enough. Enough for Julian to understand. She no longer needed hiding. He no longer needed pretending. For the first time, neither of them feared seeing each other's scars. The wind still stirred outside the porch, but now it moved past two souls seated on the same side of the table. No longer a fugitive and a shelter, just two people who chose to stay. Because one had stood at the door, and the other had stepped into the light. No one touched the box under the floor again, because it no longer needed guarding. One sentence was enough. She's my wife. And one gesture answered, I know. Nellie McCrae was not a woman who trusted easily. Since her sister's death, she had stayed on to help Julian with the house and ledgers, never as a dependent. Every morning, she burned mint leaves in the kitchen, wiped windows left to right, and insisted on using only coarse salt she'd dried herself. Not from superstition, but because she had lived long enough to see every precious thing stolen in silence. Clara, at first, was an intruder to that world, too quiet to trust, too proper to feel close. Nellie watched, but didn't intervene. Until one day, reaching beneath the cabinet for a spool of black thread, Nellie found an envelope tucked into the ledger. No sender, just a recipient. A monastery west of the border, known only to those who had once borne children and lost them. Inside, small monthly sums, not enough to notice, unless you were looking. Nellie didn't open the letter, but she flipped through the old records. There, among entries for salt, twine, and yeast, one name stood out. Emmett, age 5, lost in 1877, brown hair, small scar under left eye. A child. Perhaps the reason Clara had once vanished. That night, Clara came in from the garden, her clothes stained with late-season melon harvest. Nellie said nothing, only left a tin box on the table in Clara's room. Worn, bent at the corner, no lock, no note. Inside, a handkerchief, frayed and faded, along the edge in uneven stitches. Don't walk away from someone just because they didn't scream. Clara folded the cloth, placed it in the drawer beside her bed. That night, She didn't write, didn't burn. She sat, long and still, staring through the fogged window pane, waiting for a light not from the sky, but from something deep inside someone else. Julian never knew about the handkerchief, but passing her room, he saw her lamp still burning long into the night. And in that moment, he understood. Some wounds don't cry out. They just wait for someone quiet enough to stay. In the town of Cody, there was only one harvest festival a year, and every year it played out the same. Golden straw tied around lampposts, pumpkins stacked along the church gates, children racing through the yard like winter would never come. Men dusted off their brown shirts and old plaid scarves, shined their boots a week early. Women baked pies, pinned up their hair, pulled out dresses with flowers sewn along the hem. Everybody knew everybody, and everyone had a reason to show up, or to stay away. Julian McCrae had never been a man for crowds. For the last two festivals, he'd made excuses, a jammed cider press, a snapped bridle strap, to stay behind on the ranch. But this year, when the wagon looped by in the morning, gathering up the final stragglers, he watched it pass and turned back inside, quieter than usual. That afternoon, he stood under the eaves, watching Clara hang a sheet to dry. The breeze lifted the hem of her dress just enough to brush the weathered wood. Something in him stirred at something in her. Not urgent, not loud, but clear. He stepped forward, voice slow, like someone relearning how to ask. If you wouldn't mind, I could use someone to go with. She looked at him a long time. Didn't ask why. Didn't say no. Clara chose a dress the color of red clay. Not bold, not new, but just enough to wear to a place where folks remembered details better than faces. She tied her hair back neat, dabbed her wrists with vanilla and cinnamon water, pinned a silver brooch to her bodice. Not hers. Sarah's. The woman in the photo on Julian's wall. That morning, he'd left it in a small wooden box beside the window. No explanation. Only the quiet offering of a past that knew when to step aside. They arrived just as the music began. Lanterns lined the saloon awnings. Beneath the great maple tree, the fiddlers warmed up, drums tapping slow and steady. A few couples drifted forward. The townsfolk turned, not because Julian was there, but because he wasn't alone. He held out his hand. Clara placed hers in his. No flutter, no pause. His hand was wide, scarred from rebuilding the goat shed 2 winters ago. Hers, slender, a little dry, but steady. She didn't let go. The song was an old waltz, so familiar it asked nothing but memory. Julian wasn't much of a dancer. Clara hadn't been invited often, and yet they found a rhythm, as if steps weren't something learned, but remembered, as if neither needed to lead, so long as neither stepped away. There were whispers, side glances, a few tilted grins beneath cider-stained breath. But all that stopped the moment Julian turned Clara beneath the lantern light. Not quick, not smooth, but real. He looked only at her, and that was enough to silence a town. Because out here, folks could fake a lot of things, but not the way a man looks at a woman while dancing. They didn't return to the square. Julian led her to the edge of the field, beneath the big maple that softened the night wind. He unwrapped his scarf, handed it to her when she shivered. They sat together on an old-school bench, Once a trading table, now nothing more than a resting place. No words, just two people sharing space the way people do when they're no longer strangers. The fall breeze wasn't as sharp as last year. The music didn't sound so far away. On the ride home, they shared a seat, both eyes fixed on the red dust road ahead. Lanterns behind them flickered like memory, fading but still burning. No one mentioned the dance. But the next morning, the silver brooch remained on the corner table. Beside it, a strand of her hair, caught in the fabric of the scarf. In a land where promises blow away like chaff, only a few things stay. A glance, a hand not withdrawn, and a man who never once looked away. The last winds of autumn had shifted. No longer tumbling in from the northern ridges, they now crept through the low valley, scented with damp earth, rotting leaves, and the faint chill of a season nearing its end. The fields lay bare, harvested and hushed. Pumpkin vines withered along the old fence. Wild geese flew south in hushed flocks, as if they, too, knew not to disturb the quiet of a year closing down. Clara sat by the window, one hand steadying a hem in her lap, the other tucking away a loose strand of hair. On the table beside her, a half-drunk cup of tea had gone cold. The fire in the distant stove breathed a soft rhythm, and out near the barn, the sound of nails driving into wood echoed faint and familiar, like the breath of someone who'd lived long with labor. Julian McCrae wasn't one for idle talk, but the wood under his hands often spoke for him. That afternoon, nothing marked the hour. No gust, no rain, no sudden call. Yet something in the silence shifted. Julian stepped into the house before dusk. He didn't knock. He never had. He set his hammer beside the kitchen door, slipped off his dusted coat, and stood for a moment, not looking at anything in particular, like a man reaching for a sentence that had waited too many years to be spoken. "Clara," he said, his voice low enough to fade into the stove's gentle hiss. She looked up but didn't speak, only tilted her head slightly, waiting. "There's a room," he said, gesturing down the wooden hallway toward the end, where the brown-painted door had remained closed since the day she arrived. "If you wouldn't mind, walk with me a while." She placed her sewing aside, stood slowly, slid her feet into worn, fleece-lined shoes, and followed him. No questions, no weight in her step. Only the hush of lamplight fading behind them. The door was not locked. It never had been. But no one had opened it either. Julian paused before it, his hand resting on the tarnished brass handle. His fingers didn't shake, but they pressed, softly, like one asking permission. Then he opened it. No creaking hinges. The room welcomed them with the scent of aged paper, dry wood, and lavender long faded. A simple bed, a writing desk beneath the window, and on the wall, a single photograph. A woman in a white dress, arms curled around a book, eyes neither kind nor hard, only deep. Clara didn't ask. She simply stood still, gaze moving across the space like someone passing through a room that once held laughter, now home only to echoes. Then she stepped to the fireplace, touched its cold wooden edge, and sat in the chair beside it. As if to say, if there's an emptiness here, I don't need to rush to fill it. I'll wait. Julian sat across from her. Neither looked at the other. He watched the photo. She watched the crack in the far wall, where the afternoon light was slipping away. His voice came slowly, each word lifted from a cellar layered in dust. This is the only room I've never touched. Not once. No matter who came. No one ever stayed. Clara didn't answer right away, her head tilted as if catching the faint strains of an old melody. She reached for a book on the mantel, opened it, flipped a few pages, then said quietly, not looking at him, "Then let's begin with me reading in here." No more words were needed. They sat, he in memory, she in presence. The room had once belonged to someone loved, or someone gone, or both. No one said for sure. But now someone had returned, not to sweep away the past, but to bring a different warmth to it. The warmth of someone who did not need answers, only the chance to be seen and allowed to remain. Outside, wind rolled across dry grass, brushing the rusted windmill and tapping lightly on the glass. No birds passed by, but the neighbor's old gray cat curled on the sill, half asleep, as if it too knew. This evening was not like the others. Clara read a few lines, then sat in stillness. Julian didn't read, but he didn't leave. He rested one hand on his knee, his back gently against the chair's frame, worn but solid. And in that room, the silence between two people didn't strain. It held. Not as a wall, but as a space wide enough for both to sit without explaining themselves. After a while, Clara closed the book, placed it back on the table. She didn't say thank you. He didn't ask, "What do you think?" When she left, her steps were light, and she closed the door very slowly. Not to hide what was inside, but to hold it carefully, to keep it from falling apart now that someone had finally stepped in. Snow had fallen the night before, not a storm, just enough to frost the roof edges and sketch pale outlines around the hoofprints in the yard. Morning drifted into Dust Hollow with the dim silver light of a day that hadn't fully woken. Even the horses in the stable no longer whinnied. They only shook their heads quietly as Julian passed through to scatter the oats. Inside, the kitchen was still warm. The reading room remained as tidy as if no one had ever lingered too long in it, and the banjo hanging on the wall hadn't been touched since Sarah passed. But one small thing had changed. On the long wooden table, right beside the silver tea set, was a neat stack of papers. No envelopes, no stamps, no addressed names. Clara had left them there weeks ago, not hidden. No note. At first, Julian didn't touch them. He glanced over now and then, read a few lines, then stopped. But one morning, when the wind swept across the fence like a distant calling, he sat down, pulled the first page free, and read it. Every word, without skipping. There was no salutation, no "dear you," no "to whom it may concern," just a woman writing to herself, or perhaps to someone she hoped might understand her without needing to ask too much. The first letter spoke of a night before she ran. No details. Just vague fragments. A hand yanking hard. A cry that never left her throat. The cold of tile beneath her legs as she sat frozen in the dark. Julian read, barely blinking. When he finished, he folded the paper just as it had been, placed it back precisely. Not because he wanted to preserve it as evidence, but because he understood. This wasn't something to analyze or respond to. It was something to witness. The letters that followed came without order. Some told of mornings at a border orphanage, when Clara wrapped a nameless boy in a borrowed scarf. Others were dream fragments, wandering alone in a golden field, no one calling her name, but no one pushing her away either. He read them all, morning by morning. Not out of curiosity, but because once he'd read one, he couldn't help returning. They were like driftwood washed ashore, small, quiet pieces, but if someone were patient enough to gather each one, they could piece together a ship that once sank at sea. Clara never asked, "Did you read them?" Julian never said, "You write beautifully." But after a week, he started pouring a second cup of coffee each morning and folding an extra napkin beside the chair across from his. One winter morning, snow still hovered in the air, but no longer fell. Julian stood at the porch, breath curling into the cold like smoke. He turned back inside, set the kettle on the stove, then suddenly looked up toward the stairs. Then he said, not loud, but not softly either, "Coffee's on." He didn't wait for a reply, didn't say more. Moments later, footsteps creaked on the wood above. Clara appeared, wearing the hand-knit shawl Julian had seen hanging on the hook, but never on her shoulders. She didn't smile, didn't ask how he made the coffee. She just nodded and said quietly, almost unsure she'd said it aloud, "I know." That morning they sat in silence, only the clink of a spoon against porcelain. Sunlight spilled onto the table's edge, warming the paper edges with a soft golden hue, like early season honey. Julian didn't pick up a book, didn't fix his tools, as he usually did. Clara wrote a new page, didn't fold it, didn't hide it. She just placed it down when she finished, then stepped out to check on the sprouting bean rows in the yard. When she came back in, the page was no longer on the table. Not because someone had taken it, but because it had been read and kept. After that, they never spoke of what had come before. But each morning, 2 cups of coffee were poured, and a new letter was laid down. Not to explain, but to be believed. Each had lost someone, or a part of themselves, sometime, somewhere. But now, in a house once filled only with wind through cracks and doors that never stayed open, there were 2 people choosing to stay. Not through words, but through silence shared. Spring didn't arrive with a blaze of sunlight. It crept in slowly, through the quiet cracks of melting ice, through the soft warmth rising from the earth under each footstep across the garden. And that morning, between the long calls of sparrows and the smell of bread baking in the back kitchen, Clara knew she would not leave. She didn't need anyone to ask her to stay. But Julian had done more than that. He let her stay in the only way someone who has endured their past would understand. With respect, with space, and with a kind of patience that didn't carry the name of hope. There was no wedding, no vow spoken. But there were always 2 cups of tea, freshly poured, a new lock on the back door, a singed patch on his coat sleeve, quietly smoothed by hand. And when their eyes met across the window frame, they no longer turned away. McCrae Ranch hadn't changed much. The hills still turned gold and brown by late spring, and the north wind still made the back door creak each evening. But the things Clara had carried inside her for so long had finally been set down, like a suitcase never packed, like a fear that had been invited to sit across the table without being dismissed. On a windless afternoon, Julian walked out to the back garden and drove a small wooden stake into the still damp soil, not to mark a boundary, but to tie onto it the red ribbon Clara once used to wrap her bread. It fluttered gently, like a signal flag for all the things that didn't need to be spoken. And when a passerby came by and asked, That brown-haired woman, who is she? Julian simply said, before turning back toward the house. She's the one who's not being left anymore. Thank you for staying with us till the end of the story. If something in this tale stirred a quiet place in your heart, leave us a comment. We'd love to hear what you felt. Click like to help this story reach someone else. Someone who once needed a door left ajar, and someone brave enough to stay. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Echoes for more stories that are as gentle and fierce as you are.